Something people sometimes ask me about is chord substitutions, and that's kind of a big topic. It's not as big and mysterious as it might seem from the outside looking in, but it does take some prerequisite knowledge. How and when you would substitute chords is largely case specific, so this video isn't going to be an all-encompassing breakdown of the topic. Instead, I wanted to talk about why this chord is the same as this chord. And this will all probably shed some light on the general topic of chord substitutions. So first, let's just look at the G7. G7 is made up of the notes G, B, D, and F. So with G as the root, B is a major third above the root, D is a perfect fifth above the root, and F is a minor seventh. The G7 chord is the dominant chord in the key of C major. That's just a way of saying it's the 5 chord with more syllables. If you look at all the diatonic 7th chords, the 5 chord is the only one that's built out of a root, major third, perfect fifth, and minor 7th. So anytime you hear this type of harmony, it's screaming at you, I am the 5 chord. The function of the 5 chord is to be the climactic tension that resolves to the tonic chord, or the 1 chord. There are multiple reasons for this, but one of the foremost reasons is due to the 3rd and 7th of the chord. In a G7, the 3rd of the chord is B. In C major, this is the 7th scale degree. The 7th of the chord is F, which is the 4th scale degree. These two pitches form an interval of a diminished fifth, also known as a tritone. In a major scale, these are the only two notes that form this dissonant interval, so it's the main source of tension we typically hear in tonal music. Any dissonant interval is supposed to resolve to a consonant one, and it usually does so by half steps. In the case of a tritone, one of the notes will usually resolve up a half step and the other down a half step. In the context of a dominant 7th chord specifically, usually the 3rd goes up and the 7th goes down. When that happens, B goes up to C, and F goes down to E. C and E form a major third. They are the root and third of the 1 chord. This is mainly why the 5 chord wants to go to the 1 chord. Now, what does a G7 have to do with a B diminished 7? Let me preface it with this. There are loads of beginner music theory videos out there where they go through and show you all the triads in a major key. And as you may know, the 7 chord in a major key is a diminished triad. In C major, it's B diminished. But sometimes people in these videos will say something like, don't worry about the diminished chord, you're never going to play it, so just put it out of your mind. And I'm sorry, but that's a crock of shit. To the person who says that in their instructional video, I would ask, have you ever played a dominant 7th chord in a song before, such as G7? Because I hate to break it to you, but you're playing a diminished triad every time you do. If I take G7 and I remove G, what's left? A B diminished triad. And what's in that B diminished triad? A tritone between B and F, the same one that was in the G7. It's dissonant. Guess where it wants to resolve? C and E in the 1 chord. A dominant 7th chord includes a diminished triad within itself. Therefore, the two function the same way. So what makes a B fully diminished 7th chord? In addition to the diminished triad, we would need a diminished 7th interval above the root, which in this case would be A flat. Now, it's commonly known that a fully diminished 7th chord is a symmetrical harmony. No matter how you invert it, it's always stacked minor thirds. So consequently, none of the notes can be perceived as the root, except that's really only the case when it's presented out of context. When this chord resolves, the note that you're calling the root will resolve up a half step. If we were trudging along in the key of C, and we heard this chord, you would expect it to resolve to C major because it still has that tritone between B and F. And yes, it also has a tritone between D and A flat, but we have all this C major stuff to suggest that it would resolve to C. So, back to my original claim that G7 and B diminished 7 are the same chord. What I mean by that is that they are functionally the same. They serve the same musical purpose. They are both tensions that would resolve to the same chord. You can play either one of them in the place of the other, and they will both be similarly tense, and they'll both resolve to the same place. In fact, if you combine them, you get a G7 flat 9. Guess where this wants to resolve? C major. This is just one example of how chord substitution works. For one chord to substitute another, they need to have the same musical function. Usually they're going to have at least 2 notes in common. How it's done looks a little different in every case, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So I hope you got something out of that. Don't be afraid of diminished chords. They're very useful. If you didn't know, I teach private Zoom lessons to people around the world. If you'd like to inquire about my availability, feel free to shoot me a message. Nevertheless, thank you for watching as always, and I will see you next week.